Hey everybody, what's going on? It's Mr. White here with your Unit 2 test review, so go ahead and get out that gray review paper and follow along as we go over these answers. Alright, first thing you need to know is how to draw the circular flow model. Remember, we watched that video about how goods and services are exchanged for money and how resources are also exchanged for money in a free market economy. So, first thing you need to know about is the factor market. Remember that households sell factors of production to businesses. Okay? Once the businesses get the factors of production, they create goods and services, which they turn around and sell to households in something called the product market. Now, obviously, all these things are not exchanged for free. Money has to change hands. So, when households get goods and services, they spend money. So the arrow right there with money is called spending. The next thing, that spending, when it comes into the business, it's known as revenue. Revenue is the total amount of money brought in by a business for selling goods and services. Then, the businesses use that revenue to pay households for their input costs. So when businesses pay for factors of production, that's called input costs. And that comes into households as income. So this is just a really simple model for how a free market economy ought to function. All right, next up. What is GDP? What are its components? And what percentage does each represent? This is actually like numbers 2 and 3. So GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, or the total dollar value of all final goods and services produced in our economy in a given period of time, usually 1 year. So the formula for GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Okay? Here's a little pie chart to show you how that breaks down. So consumption or consumer spending makes up about 70% of our GDP. It's the biggest part. Business investment accounts for about 15%. It's pretty big, but it's not the biggest, okay? Now, government spending is slightly bigger than business investment. Government spending accounts for about 20%. And then last up is net exports. Now, you may have noticed that 70 plus 15 plus 20 equals 105. So the reason why that makes sense is because with net exports, we actually lose 5% of GDP. The reason why is because we have what's called a trade deficit. That means that the value of the goods and services we purchase from other countries exceeds the value of goods and services that we sell to other countries. So for that reason, our net exports is actually a negative number every year. Remember that consumer spending just means anything that we buy. So let's go ahead and talk about it. So I actually have a slide for this, so it makes sense that we just go to the slide that actually talks about it. Examples of the GDP components. So consumer spending means anything that's purchased by consumers like me and you. So if you go buy a new pair of shoes, that's a great example of consumer spending. Now, business investment is any time that a business spends money now to try to make more money in the future. So for example, if Exxon paid a lot of money, maybe millions or billions of dollars to construct a new office building in Houston, that's an example of Exxon spending money now on something that's going to help them make more money in the future. So that's considered business investment. Okay? Government spending, for example, the state of Texas could build 10,000 miles of new roads. If the state of Texas builds roads, the state of Texas government is paying for them. That's an example of government spending. And last up is net exports. For example, if Boeing, which is an American airplane company, sells $2 billion worth of airplanes to Germany, that would be an export. And if Apple purchased $2 billion worth of new iPhones from manufacturers in China, that would count as an import. So just remember that any of these things, consumer spending, business investment, government spending, or imports and exports, those are the things that are going to count towards the components of our GDP. Well, then that brings us to what's not included in our GDP. One thing we don't include ever is transfer payments. Guys, please remember this. This is one that people always get wrong. We don't count things like stocks or bonds or social security payments. The reason why those things don't count is because that's just one person handing money to another person. No good or service is created. Hopefully you remember that as economists, when we look at GDP, we don't care about the dollar value. What we really care about is productivity. So if no good or service is produced, we don't want to count that in our GDP. Okay, so stocks, they don't count. Next up, the informal economy. The informal economy means any kind of services or goods that are generated but not recorded by the government. So like if you mow your own lawn, that would be considered a non-market activity. When you mow your own lawn, you're doing a service, but you're doing it for yourself. You probably don't get paid, and I don't think you're going to report that to the IRS, so it's not in our GDP. Now, The black market is also something that we can't account for because the black market includes illegal goods and services. So for example, if you're selling drugs is something that obviously is not ever reported, and so therefore we can't record it in our GDP. I'm sure our GDP would be a lot higher if we recorded that. Now, resale items like used stuff. For example, if you went to GameStop and bought a used PSP, the used PSP has already been counted once in our GDP before, and so we don't want to count it again because that would amount to double counting. Speaking of double counting, we don't want to count intermediate goods. Like for example, if you go buy a burger at Jack in the Box and that burger has lettuce on it, we don't count the lettuce in the burger. The reason why is because we only want to count final goods and services. So in that scenario, the burger that you buy is the final good, and all the inputs that go into making the burger don't count, because if we counted things like the lettuce and the burger, it would amount to double counting. And once again, like I said, we don't want to double count because as economists, when we look at that GDP number, it tells us how much we produced. So if it's not reflecting what we produced, we don't want to include that in our GDP. All right. Next up, let's talk about the difference between real and nominal GDP. Hopefully you remember that nominal means not adjusted for inflation. So if we're talking about nominal GDP, it's GDP calculated in current prices, like how much stuff costs today. This is not a good indicator of our productivity because if you remember from that example we saw with the cars and the trucks, we can make the same amount of cars and trucks this year as we did last year, but if the price of those cars and trucks inflated, it would seem as if we were more productive this year than last year, even though we created the exact same amount of goods and services. So that's why economists want to use real GDP. Real GDP is adjusted for inflation. It's GDP calculated using prices from a base year. And this is our best indication of true economic productivity. So in order to calculate real GDP, you got to know the nominal GDP and you need to know the price index, which is the GDP deflator. So real GDP is equal to nominal GDP divided by our GDP deflator, or the price index, right, times 100. So GDP per capita. Per capita simply means per person. So real GDP divided by population tells us the real GDP per capita. This is useful for economists because it's an indicator of the productive potential of every person in society. In other words, how much we expect each person to contribute to the productivity of our economy. So keep in mind that GDP per capita doesn't mean how much money each person earns, but instead it's just a measure of how much productivity each person can create based on the country where they live. All right, now the business cycle. Remember that the business cycle is that graph that shows how real GDP changes over time. It looks like this. Please remember what the business cycle looks like. You know, last year on this test, I had a lot of people drawing the circular flow model when they should be drawing the business cycle. So please make sure you know the difference between those two. The business cycle shows us how real GDP changes over time, and that's why it's the best measure of economic productivity, okay? Real GDP tells us how much we produced. So the business cycle is really a measure of productivity over time, okay? Business cycle measures our productivity over time. Now, one business cycle is measured from trough to trough. Remember, the trough is the lowest part. I know it looks like tro, but we pronounce it trough. So from one trough to the next trough, it kind of makes like a camel hump. One camel hump is one business cycle. And one business cycle typically lasts about 5 to 7 years. Okay, when it comes to the business cycle, it helps us to know, well, the business cycle, I should say, indicates to us what's happening in the economy, and that has implications for unemployment and inflation. So, in the expansion phase of the business cycle, real GDP starts to rise. When real GDP is rising, we expect the unemployment rate to fall, and the inflation rate will start creeping up. The reason why is because as more people get more jobs, the demand increases, and we know that when demand increases, prices increase. The expansion phase is like what happened in the United States during the Roaring 20s. Now, we know the Roaring 20s were great, but they couldn't last forever. So eventually the economy hit a peak. The peak is the highest that the business cycle will go. That's when our GDP stops rising. And as the GDP stops rising, that means our unemployment rate stops falling, but the inflation rate stops rising. So everything kind of pauses for a moment. Of course, after the pause, though, we're going to start heading down in the other direction, and that's the contraction phase. In the contraction phase of the business cycle, real GDP is falling, and so that usually means that unemployment is rising. As businesses make less money, they can't afford to hire as many people, so they have to have layoffs and they fire people. That causes the unemployment rate to go up, and as the unemployment rate goes up, consumer demand goes down. When consumer demand goes down, businesses are forced to cut their prices in order to try to stimulate more consumer demand. Now, this is like what happened during the Great Depression. We actually had prices falling during the Great Depression, mostly because the unemployment rate was rising so much. Now, at some point, the unemployment rate has to stop rising and the inflation rate has to stop falling. Real GDP has to stop falling, and then we hit what's called the trough. In the trough, the unemployment rate stops rising and the inflation rate stops falling. So after the trough, we head back into an expansion phase, which could also sometimes be called a recovery. Okay, now the business cycle and productivity. Okay, the business cycle is just a graphic representation of how GDP changes over time, right? We talked about this. So if real GDP is economic productivity, it stands to reason that the business cycle shows us how productivity changes over time. Now you notice I've talked about this on like 3 slides. It's going to be very important for you to know this on the short answer. Please don't forget this, guys. The short answer is too easy on this test. If you miss it, it's just because you're not paying attention or you didn't study. All right. Number 10 is about factors that can cause economic growth. So the first factor that could cause economic growth is what's called capital investment, aka capital deepening. This means that when we spend money on things like schools or factories or communication infrastructure today, it's going to help us to grow more in the future. So I know that it might not always be fun to spend money on those things. Maybe we'd rather pay for a football stadium, but paying for a football stadium does not help us in the future. So when we put off our enjoyment today to have more enjoyment down the road, that's called capital deepening, and it helps our economy grow. Now, population growth is something else that can help our economy grow. The larger our labor force becomes, the more that we can produce in our society. Something else that can help our economy grow is having more natural resources. Remember that available resources influences our production. Just think of our production possibilities frontier. When we get more resources, the amount of stuff we can produce grows. So more resources equals more productivity. Now, stable government. I cannot emphasize this enough. If you live in a country where the government's not stable, where there's no rule of law, businesses won't want to open in your country. The reason why is because rule of law increases predictability for businesses. Businesses like to be able to anticipate what's coming down the road. And it also allows for more economic growth when more businesses feel comfortable opening up in your country. Now, education and technical knowledge is also very important. Populations that are more educated and have more human capital are generally more productive. They know how to use more technology, and of course we know that technology allows us to do more. Like, for example, you're getting all your studying done tonight, and you're going to do it in less than an hour, and I'm going to cram your head full of knowledge because we've got the beautiful technology of YouTube. All right, now, last thing is free trade. I know that some people today would have you think that free trade is bad for America, but remember that whenever it's voluntary, free trade always benefits both parties involved. So when we trade with the rest of the world, we are able to do more because we can get more of what we want, we can get more inputs, and we have more places to sell the things that we produce, so there's more incentive to produce. So free trade, education, stable government, natural resources, population growth, and capital investment are all factors that can cause the economy to grow. Now, unemployment. Not a fun topic, but it's something we need to talk about. That means the people in the labor force who are eligible to work and are actively seeking a job, but for one reason or another they can't find a job. So the unemployment rate is a measure of the percentage of the labor force who are seeking work but can't find work. The way we calculate the unemployment rate is we take the number of people who are unemployed divided by the labor force times 100, and that gives us our overall unemployment rate. Now, the types of unemployment. The first kind, which is actually considered positive for the economy, is called frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is when people are unemployed because they're taking their time to find a job that really matches their skills or their job preferences. Like if you're a recent college grad who has several job interviews lined up, you're not likely to take the first offer. You're going to wait till you've had all the offers, and then you'll make a decision about which job is going to make you better off. Okay? Now, frictional unemployment is one of the kinds of unemployment that's included in our natural rate of unemployment. Hopefully you remember the natural rate of unemployment is between 4 to 6%. Now, the other part of that 4 to 6% natural rate of unemployment is called structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is when people are unemployed because there has been a fundamental change to the industry in which they work. Like, for example, if you were somebody who worked at Blockbuster Video, as soon as Netflix came out, your job prospects diminished to the point where now, if you wanted to work at a video rental store, you're almost not going to be able to find any jobs like that at all in the economy, because those skills are just no longer in demand, mostly because we have a better way of doing things. We have better technology. And I'm sure you could think of dozens of examples of that. Like, for example, a milkman. We don't have people deliver milk to us anymore. Or somebody who worked for Kodak Film Company. We don't buy film anymore because now we all have digital cameras in our phones. So even though structural unemployment is considered healthy for the economy at large, because it means that our economy is growing and we're getting better, more efficient ways to do things, it's always going to be very painful for the people who experience structural unemployment, because they're going to need to retrain to be able to find another job. Otherwise, they're going to stay unemployed for a long time. Now, the worst kind of unemployment, the most unhealthy kind, is called cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is when people are unemployed due to a contraction of the business cycle, meaning that due to circumstances beyond their control, they've lost their job, mostly just because the whole economy is down. So, for example, if you're a store clerk who gets laid off because the store where you work is not selling enough products, probably the reason why they're not selling enough products is because consumer demand is down, and most likely that's due to a contraction of the business cycle. So the way you can remember cyclical unemployment is that the word cyclical is derived from the word cycle. So it's caused by a downturn of the business cycle. Just know that any amount of unemployment above 6% would be considered cyclical. So if we had 10% unemployment in our economy, we could say that 4% of that unemployment is definitely cyclical unemployment, because 4% is the difference between 10% and 6%. All right, last up, seasonal unemployment, very easy to understand. We know that at different times of the year, different skills are in demand. So when people are unemployed because their skills are only in demand at a certain time of the year, that's what we call a seasonal unemployed worker. So if you're a lifeguard in December, you're probably not going to find very many jobs. You will be seasonally unemployed. Now, seasonal unemployment doesn't figure into our natural rate. We actually adjust for seasonal unemployment to take that out of the measure altogether. All right, labor force. The labor force is equal to employed plus unemployed workers. You must know that, okay? Let me say it one more time. The labor force is equal to the employed plus the unemployed workers. Go ahead and write that down. Maybe circle it, highlight it, put a star next to it. You're going to need to know that on the test. All right. Now, to be counted in the labor force, first of all, you got to be old enough to work. In the United States, that means older than 16. You have to be a civilian, so people in the military don't count. You have to be non-institutionalized, which means you can't be in jail or prison or some sort of like a mental hospital. And you have to be working or actively seeking work. Within the last 4 weeks, you have to be doing that. Like, you have to put in an application somewhere within the last 4 weeks. If you don't meet those criteria, you are not part of the labor force. You're not even counted in the labor force, which means you're also not counted in the unemployment rate. So when we talk about the labor force participation rate, what we're saying is the size of our adult population divided by the size of the labor force times 100. That'll tell you what percentage of adults are actually participating in the labor force. Currently, about 62% of adults in the United States are in the labor force. So that means that our labor force participation rate is about 62%. All right, factors that can change the labor force participation rate. The first thing is a change to the size of our population. So if we had a large influx of immigrants to the USA, that's going to change our labor force participation rate because it's going to change the size of our adult population. Also, changes to labor force institutions or technology, like, for example, if we passed a law that banned unions, or if we adopted some sort of new job search technology online, that will change the amount of people who are employed or unemployed, and thus it will change the labor force participation rate. Last of all is changes to government policies. If the government institutes like a new job training program, like the New Deal or something like that, that would definitely change our labor force participation rate, and therefore that would be one of the factors you'd need to know about. All right, factors that can increase unemployment. There are a couple different things that economists recognize as possibly causing unemployment to increase. The first one would be minimum wage laws. Whenever the government institutes a price floor on the labor market, like a minimum wage law, it increases the equilibrium price of labor. So just think about that graph we drew, the supply and demand graph, where we had our price floor. Remember, price floor is always above equilibrium. In that graph, the supply is equal to all the workers who are willing and able to supply their labor, and the demand is equal to all the businesses that are willing and able to demand their labor. So, ceteris paribus, the quantity of labor demanded will fall, and the quantity of labor supplied will rise if the price is kept above equilibrium. Therefore, it'll result in a surplus of labor, meaning that we'll have more unemployment. Now, next thing that can increase unemployment is labor unions. Remember that labor unions increase equilibrium wages as well. So just like in the minimum wage situation, if a place has strong unions, then the cost of labor there is going to be higher, and that can create a surplus of labor. Now, efficiency wages, we're going to talk about that a little later on, but efficiency wages means when some businesses pay higher than the equilibrium wage to attract and retain the best quality workers. This will often lead to a surplus of workers who are willing and able to supply their labor, and for whatever reason they can't find a job, because now with the efficiency wage being so high, the number of workers demanded will be lower. But we don't need to have as many workers if we have more efficient workers. That's why it's called an efficiency wage. All right, unemployment insurance. When the government gives out money to people who are unemployed through no fault of their own, usually people who are cyclically unemployed, it lowers their incentive to find another job quickly. They're going to take their time to find a job because they've got money coming in. They're not desperate. So, therefore, frictional unemployment increases whenever unemployment insurance is offered by the government. Now, last up, contractions of the business cycle. We know when the business cycle contracts, it increases cyclical unemployment because we know cyclical unemployment is caused by a downturn in the business cycle. Pretty simple. All right, now let's talk about inflation. Real quick, guys, inflation is just a general increase in the cost of goods and services in our economy. So the reason why inflation is bad is because it causes our money to lose purchasing power. Our money loses value when things get more expensive. Therefore, it takes more money to buy the things this year that you bought last year. Now, inflation creates winners and losers in the economy. So when it comes to things like loans or contracts, if somebody were to lend money at a fixed rate of interest, meaning like the interest rate that they're getting doesn't change, unanticipated inflation depletes the profits of the lender. When a lender charges interest on a loan, they're hoping to get a little bit of profit and to have a little bit of money to cover the costs of their money that they loaned losing value, because we know that money loses value over time. So if the inflation rate is higher than the lender anticipates, it's going to cut into their profits. On the flip side, you become a winner if you borrow money at a fixed rate of interest and the inflation becomes higher than anticipated, because when you borrow money at a fixed rate of interest, you're agreeing to pay back money that's going to end up being worth less than it was when you borrowed it. And so you get extra benefit from the money you borrowed. And therefore, you're a winner, not a loser. Not a loser, folks. Not a loser. All right. MPC, marginal propensity to consume. That means the portion of a dollar that is spent when your disposable income rises by $1. So, for example, we talked about like if you were walking home from school and you found $100, you might choose to go spend $80 and then just save the rest. Okay? So, when we talk about the MPC, that's equal to the change in consumer spending divided by the change in disposable income. Therefore, if your disposable income increased by $100, your spending increased by $80, it would be 80 divided by 100, which is equal to 0.8. So your marginal propensity to consume in this scenario would be 0.8. Now, the opposite of the marginal propensity to consume is the marginal propensity to save. That's the portion of a dollar that is saved when your disposable income rises by $1. So, in our example, just a moment ago, you spent $80 and you saved the rest, $20. Okay? So, in this scenario, we would say the marginal propensity to save is equal to 1 minus the MPC. Therefore, your marginal propensity to save is 1 minus 0.8, and 1 minus 0.8 is 0.2. So in this scenario, your marginal propensity to save is 0.2. Now, the reason why we need to know the marginal propensity to save and the marginal propensity to consume is because it helps us to understand the multiplier effect. That means that a change in aggregate spending, meaning like total spending, will cause a proportionally larger change to our economic productivity. You know, our real GDP. Okay, so It's related to the marginal propensity to consume and save because you got to know those statistics in order to calculate the spending multiplier. If you know the MPC and the MPS, or even just one or the other, you can calculate how much real GDP will increase or decrease if there's a change to spending in the economy. Like, for example, if consumer spending changes, if government spending changes, or if business investment changes. Where have we heard of those before? Oh yeah, those are components of GDP. Please don't forget that. So the formula to figure out our spending multiplier, the effect of our spending, meaning like how much is our spending going to change GDP, is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC, or you could say 1 divided by MPS. That's going to give you your spending multiplier. And then you just use that spending multiplier to multiply by whatever the change in spending is. So for example, if your MPC is 0.8, your MPS is 0.2, we'd say 1 divided by 0.2. 1 divided by 0.2, if you want to go ahead and calculate it, is equal to 0.5. So that would mean our spending multiplier is 0.5. So any change in our economy would be multiplied by 0.5. Like, for example, if consumer spending increased by $100 billion, we would multiply 100 billion times 5, and that would tell us that the effect of our change in spending would be that GDP would increase by $500 billion. Just look at the notes that are on Edmodo for an example of this one. I got the whole thing about spending multiplier on Edmodo. All right, stagflation. This is the combination of high unemployment and high inflation at the same time, okay? Not good. This is really like the worst possible scenario for our economy. Luckily, stagflation is pretty rare. The last time we saw major stagflation was in the 1970s. Of course, stagflation back then was so bad, you know, the cost of things like food was rising at the same time as unemployment was rising, and the economy was in such a tough position that it actually caused us to change our political parties that were in power. At the time, Jimmy Carter was president, but because the economy was so bad, people voted him out of office after just one term and elected Ronald Reagan. So that just shows that when something like stagflation is going on, nobody's happy, and it can cause major implications for whoever's in charge of our country at that time. All right, efficiency wages. We talked about this a moment ago, but let's revisit one more time, okay? An efficiency wage is when employers pay higher than average wages to attract and retain the very best workers. So, my favorite example is my favorite soccer player, Cristiano Ronaldo, okay? He's considered one of the best soccer players in the world. I think he's the very best. I know, don't get mad at me. I know we got some Messi fans out there. Lionel Messi's good too, but of course, Ronaldo is the current holder of the Ballon d'Or, which is the award for the best soccer player in the world. So for right now, I'm going to say Ronaldo's the best. Recently, his team that he plays for, Real Madrid, just gave him a new contract that pays him $50 million a year before taxes. Holy cockatoli, right? That's a lot of money. So Ronaldo's thinking, man, I better work hard. The reason why Real Madrid wants to pay Ronaldo so much money is that, number one, it's going to encourage him to be more productive, right? When you're happy, you work harder. And hopefully that means he's going to score more goals and help them win more games. This is also going to prevent him from seeking other job opportunities at other teams. It's going to be hard for any other team to lure him away because I don't know that any other team could afford to pay him that much. This is also going to increase the other number of high-quality applicants that will want to go to a team like Real Madrid. When other soccer players see that Real Madrid is paying such high wages, it increases the desirability of playing at a club like Real Madrid. So if you pay a top athlete to play for your team, especially if you pay them a lot of money, that's a great example of an efficiency wage. All right, the Consumer Price Index. Hopefully you remember that that's just a measure of the cost of living for a typical urban family of four. Okay? We calculate it using a metaphorical market basket of goods. The market basket just looks at what the average family of four buys in a year in terms of the quantity and the cost. Then we put together a market basket. We say, okay, the average family spends X amount of dollars per month. I think in 2016 it was something like $3,600 a month. So to calculate the Consumer Price Index, which is just a price index similar to the GDP Deflator, what we do is we say the CPI is equal to the current market basket cost divided by the market basket cost in our base year times 100. So to calculate the CPI, you need to know the cost of the market basket this year and the cost of the market basket in the base year. Now, The GDP deflator is the same thing, except instead of being for the market basket of goods, the GDP deflator removes inflation from our GDP. So it's a price index that is used to calculate real GDP. Real GDP is equal to our nominal GDP divided by the GDP deflator times 100. So if you don't know the GDP deflator, the way you would figure out the GDP deflator is you'll take just 1 year. We can call this year 2, whatever the later year is. We'll take the nominal GDP from the later year. Then we'll take the nominal GDP from our base year. I guess you could think of that as year 1. So the nominal GDP from year 2 divided by real GDP from the base year times 100 will give us our GDP deflator. It's very much the same way that we calculate the consumer price index, basically the exact same formula, except we're not using the market basket of goods, we're using GDP. All right, market competition. This is something that we studied way back in Unit 1, but I got a couple refresher questions on this test about market competition, so let's refresh your brain about what that means. Remember that there are different levels of competition in our economy, and it's great that we have competition because competition is what allows supply and demand to work. It's what causes markets to always return to equilibrium, and it's also something that results in us having more products to choose from, better prices on those products, and also better quality of products. So the most competitive type of market is called perfect competition because the products being offered for sale are identical. Also, there are just many buyers and sellers of these products, and because of the fact that the products are identical and there's many buyers and sellers who all know the basic price, no producer or consumer gets to choose the price. Prices in perfect competition are 100% decided by supply and demand. So some examples of products that are governed by perfect competition would be like stocks on the stock market, diamonds that you would buy from a diamond retailer, or oranges that you buy at the supermarket. All those things are virtually identical, so it's the market that determines the price of those things, not the sellers or even the buyers. Now, with the next kind of competition that's a little bit more competitive, monopolistic competition. In monopolistic competition, the products are nearly identical. I mean, for example, jeans, one pair of jeans is virtually the same as another pair of jeans. They're blue, they're made of denim, they cover your butt, they have 5 pockets, okay? They're all about the same. But there's many buyers and sellers like in perfect competition, and the thing that makes this different from perfect competition is that we have brand competition. Meaning that in monopolistic competition, there are lots of different brand names. So if you're thinking about jeans, just imagine how many different brands of jeans you can buy. Even though they're all similar, the thing that differentiates them is whatever brand they have on the back pocket. Okay? So this means that producers can have a mini monopoly over their particular brand. For example, there's only one company that's allowed to call their jeans Levi and have the Levi logo, and that's Levi Jeans. If anybody else tries to make Levi jeans, Levi's can sue them. So that means that Levi has some control over their price because they're the only one who's allowed to make Levi's. So some examples of things that exist in monopolistic competition would be like clothing or watches or toothpaste, pretty much anything where there are many different identical types of that thing, but they all have different brand names. Now, next up is oligopoly. With an oligopoly, the products are nearly identical, kind of like in monopolistic competition. But the thing that differentiates an oligopoly is that in this type of competition, there's only about 5 or maybe even fewer than 5 companies that account for more than 80% of the production of that good or service. So that means there's not much in the way of price competition. Basically, they sort of peacefully coexist and they don't compete with each other very much, which means that the producers aren't very responsive to their consumers. They don't really care if the quality of their product is not so good. The customer service for oligopolies tends to be pretty terrible, and generally the prices aren't real great, and you don't have much choice because all of the sellers are charging almost the same price for their products. A great example could be like airlines or your cell phone company or even oil and gas companies. The products they sell are almost the same, and it would be really difficult for any of us to get into selling those products, and that's why there's not much competition in these markets. Now, the kind of market that has zero competition is called a monopoly. In a monopoly, the product they offer is unique. Nobody else can offer it, and there's only one producer of that product, so there's no competition at all. And that one producer has total control over the price. So because of the fact they don't have any competition, they're not at all responsive to consumers. They really don't care what the consumer wants. A great example of this could be like the NFL. if you want to watch pro football in America, the NFL is your one and only option. I know there's arena football and you know, college football, but remember, those aren't professional football. And I think most of us would agree that the quality of play that we see in those sports is not the same as NFL football. So if you want to watch pro football, the NFL is your one and only option. So the NFL gets to decide everything about how pro football works. All right, guys, that's it for the test. The last little thing you need to think about is the fact that there's going to be a short answer section, okay, the FRQ section. And in the FRQ section, you need to know about the business cycle. That's the first thing. And the second thing is you need to know how to calculate real GDP and sort of an idea of what the components of GDP are and how that breaks down, okay? So if you have any questions, of course, you can email me or hit me up on Remind. Otherwise, guys, good luck on your test.